Winston Churchill famously said that the best argument against democracy was a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. One of the other famous sayings about democracy is that the best part about democracy is that everybody gets to vote, and the worst part about democracy is that everyone gets to vote, meaning that there are going to be a lot of idiots in society or people who just don't know anything about what they are voting on who are nevertheless going to have a great amount of power in the voting process. And chess players, surprisingly enough, have recently proved this to be correct. Some chess players have somewhat jokingly recently started complaining about elections and the voting system and claiming that a lot of idiots are voting on things that they know nothing about. Now, how did this come up? What does chess have to do with democracy? Well, the best chess player in the world is a Norwegian player named Magnus Carlsen. Some people believe he's one of the top 5 best chess players of all time. And Magnus Carlsen semi recently launched a game that was called Magnus Carlsen Against the World. It was hosted on a website called chess.com, which is a very famous and popular online chess website with thousands of regular players. And Magnus took the white pieces in this game, and what would happen is he'd make a move with the white pieces, and then the rest of the people on chess.com, all the online users with their accounts, would all vote on what move black should use to respond to Magnus's moves with the white pieces. So for example, Magnus might move one pawn to e4 with the white pieces, and then all of the different users on chess.com might vote to move their own pawn to e5, for example, with the black pieces. Then maybe Magnus would move one of his white knights to another square, and then maybe the black users would all vote to move one of their knights to a square, and so on and so forth. And what the idea basically was is that the best chess player in the world was going to make the move, and then the rest of the chess players in the world were going to vote on their own move together. The idea being that even if one individual chess player was not smart enough to take down Magnus Carlsen on their own, maybe it would be kind of interesting to see how all the genius of the world's chess players combined could do against Magnus, with all of them simultaneously working together to try and beat the best chess player in the world. But rather unsurprisingly, they came very close to failing until some of the higher rated players pointed out that they were about to lose the game. And I'm going to explain how that happened here very briefly. So, in chess, there's something called ratings, and we have to understand this in order to understand what the problem with the moves that the players were making against Magnus was. So, if you win a game in chess, you get some points added to your quote unquote score, a score that's permanently attached to your name. If you lose a game in chess, then you have some points subtracted from that score that's attached to your name. And if you draw a game in chess, then usually you don't really get any points added to your game. There's a few exceptions to that, but it's not important for this video. So the idea is that the highest rated players in the world, or the best players in the world, have the highest chess ratings in the world, and the worst players in the world, or towards the bottom, have the lowest ratings in the world. And then there's a bunch of players who are kind of in between. And where you rank on the chess scale of greatness is often correlated to your rating. So if you have a rating, let's say a chess rating of 800, you're often seen to be pretty much just a beginner who barely knows what they're doing. If you have a chess rating of 1200, then you're often seen as someone who has a decent idea of what they're doing, but they're still going to lose and make some pretty common mistakes. If you're a chess player who has a rating of 1500, then you're often seen as someone who has a semi-decent idea of what they're doing. They've got some ideas down pat, but they still have some pretty big flaws in their playing. Once you get to around 2000, you're seen as somebody who's really good but not a professional. Once you get to 2500, you're what's called a grandmaster. And Magnus Carlsen has a rating of about 2800, which is incredibly hard to attain. Okay, so what does this have to do with the chess world, and what does this have to do with voting? Where does the voting all come into this? Well, what happens is, the problem is, the vast majority of the chess players on chess.com are somewhere around 800. In fact, I'm going to actually show a graph on the screen here of the average rating on chess.com for rapid games. Those are games that are around 15 minutes or so. And you can see here that The vast majority of players on chess.com fall into the lower rated category. It actually says that the average rating on chess.com is 633. Now, it does have to be said that that rating is probably inflated because there's probably a bunch of players who made accounts on chess.com and then abandoned them and never played again. So there's probably a bunch of inflated, that graph is probably inflated by the number of abandoned accounts on there. But the fact remains the vast majority of players on chess.com are pretty bad at chess. But when it comes to the game against Magnus Carlsen, they all have quote unquote equal votes with the higher rated players. So let's say you have a player who's, let's say, 2,000 on chess.com, and then you have 30 players who are rated 800 on chess.com. The player who's rated 2,000 gets one vote. The players who are rated 800 also each get one vote. So the player who's rated 2,000 might calculate a better move than the players who are rated 800, but ultimately the players who are rated 800 are still going to end up outvoting the one player who's rated 2,000. And that's pretty much exactly what happened. So I'm going to show the game up on the screen here. Very recently, the players were voting, and you can actually still see the percentage of players who voted for this move. The players wanted to vote for a move with the black pieces to move the black bishop from the square f8 to the square c5. And they wanted to try to pin the white knight to the black queen and threaten the black queen in this manner. Now, however, this is a terrible move. And the reason that it's a terrible move is because the white knight on d4 can actually take the black knight on the square c6 and check the king in the process. And when a black king is put into check, or when a king is put into check, you are obligated to remove the king from check, which means that black would have had to recapture with either the pawn on b7 or the pawn on d7. And in the process of taking that knight, if white took black's knight, and then black would be forced to recapture the white knight now, white would have had free reign to go ahead and snatch up the free bishop left on c5. And right there, black would have lost the game. And that might be a little hard to visualize for some of the players who don't play chess, but for anybody who does play chess, that'll be pretty easy for them to visualize. But yeah, right there, black would have completely lost the game. So obviously that should be a move that none of the players on the black side would ever consider, right? Wrong. That move was actually the most popular move. They voted for it more than any other move that's out there. In fact, if you actually look at the percentages now, even now, it still has 36% of the votes. Now, however, a bunch of players started freaking out about the fact that all the lower rated players were voting for that cool looking move, and they started countering back and trying to vote for the other move, knight takes d4, which is basically just, instead of moving the bishop out, they wanted the black knight to capture the white knight. But the fact of the matter is, it's quite terrifying that the black players, voting, came that close to voting for such a terrible move that would blunder a knight that way. And they genuinely voted for that move. Why? Because most of them are, quite frankly, just too bad at chess to recognize that that is in fact a bad move. And since they all have an equal say when it comes to voting, the chess players very nearly came close to losing to Magnus Carlsen pretty much in the opening stages of the game. They haven't even gotten into a back and forth fight with him. It's just the few opening moves of the game, and they've already nearly lost the darn thing just because so many of the lower rated players are so terrible at chess that they can't even recognize basic moves like that. And I think that's a pretty good analogy for democracy and voting in general. There are a lot of people out there in the world who are pretty dumb. They have absolutely no idea what's going on in politics. They don't know what good decision making is or anything like that. But hey, they've got just as much say in democracy